is recognized as a leading voice in this field and is a frequently requested guest speaker at schools and conferences. Adam is even invited to lead training workshops for the admissions staff at colleges and universities, most recently at USC and Caltech. So we invited Adam here today because the testing landscape is always changing, and the topic invites more questions and anxiety than more than any other part of the college process. And we know that Adam will be able to make sense of it all for you tonight. He's here to share insights on how to help students and parents successfully navigate the testing requirements of college admission. We have copies of the Compass Prep book available for you. And one of the things I would just add is that one of the other reasons why we invited Adam tonight is that we've noticed over the last couple of years when we refer students and families to additional information about testing, this is the book that we refer them to. So please make sure you grab a copy tonight. It's a wonderful resource with 100 pages of everything you ever wanted to know about testing. There's also a card in the back of the book that if you want to fill it out to receive more information from Compass, you'll get monthly updates on different topics and mock testing opportunities. So please fill that out and leave that here tonight. And without further ado, because you don't want to hear me talk anymore, I'm going to pass it over to Adam.
Well, hi everybody. Thank you, Kalia, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Carolyn, as well, for having me. I'm realizing the past couple weeks I've been doing these talks, my introduction mentions USC, and yes, but of late there's been some issues there, and I was a student athlete. I was actually a walk-on, but legitimately, no one bribed a coach to put me on the team back in 1993. So it's good to be here. I'm going to try to make this very practical, and if I can, I'll make it interesting. I can't promise that, but I'll try. And you'll leave here feeling like this part of the college process that students really start to face in earnest over the next year to year and a half, that you have a handle on it, know exactly how you'll deal with the testing process as it comes down the pike. Okay. This is not the most exciting topic on its face. I'll do my best to enliven it, but it will be at least useful. Most of what I have to say comes from now being in my third decade doing this work, working with students and families, trying to help them figure out this part of the process and manage it successfully. So most of what I have to share is from all that time in the weeds with these tests and figuring out what are the best ways to think about them and deal with them from a student's perspective. It will sound in a few moments like I'm up here dispensing parenting advice. That's a little bit bold for me to do because while I have 4 children, my oldest is only in 8th grade. So what do I know about the high school years? I know a lot vicariously, and I think over the years I've developed a good sense of what really is a really healthy, productive, constructive role for parents to play. What are the key decisions in which your voice is really important? And I can also tell you without holding back, what does it look like when parents are over-involved in this piece of it and it's counterproductive? So to give you a thumbnail of Compass, we work with students around the world, but our headquarters are in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and we work with a lot of very, shall we say, aggressive, sophisticated families, including many who were amongst the group that was indicted in this scandal. So they started with us, moved on to something, more of a sure thing, shall we say, or so they thought. Boy, it's an awkward time to be doing this talk. So I'll have some advice along the way about how parents should be involved. Let me start with a bit of perspective. So I have no problem. It's easy to find things in our popular culture that poke fun at our concern we have for these tests. This one is a classic. Test scores on a tombstone. It's meant to be absurd. You don't have to roll in the aisle laughing, but I hope you get the joke immediately that this is not how important the tests actually are. It begs the question of how much do the scores matter? 2019 college admission landscape, what to make of these scores and their role. They remain quite important broadly. And one of the ways to understand that, if I take just a minute to defend the test before I then spend more time being critical of them, here is from the college admission side of the desk, here's the picture that they're facing. So you think about all the different inputs in an application. Think about high school students' grade point averages. Back when I was a college or a high school 11th grader, this was a distribution of GPAs nationally. So all students, 12th graders applying to 4-year colleges, that's the population that the slide references. Back then there were more B students than A students. And B was the most common GPA within the applicant pool broadly. Now, just a few years ago, there's more A's than B's, and that distribution has really shifted. So a few comments. One, I don't mean to suggest for even a moment that the transcript is not the most important factor. It is the most important factor. If colleges had to, identify, what is most important, they would say what you've done in the classroom day in and day out for years, the context, your school and its pedagogy and its reputation, and then also the rigor of your curriculum. Have you been able to challenge yourself, and what does that look like? That is the most important consideration and the most important indicator of whether you're ready to go and do college level work. But no single piece of an application by itself tells everything, and college admissions folks generally would prefer to have more information, not less. And test scores, as problematic as they are, and they're problematic, there's a lot about them that culturally is tough. They're very strong, enduring correlation with family income. A lot of things about standardized testing that are problematic, but they do a few things well. Here's the distribution of SAT scores. And I can show you this data at any point going back decades. The ACT distribution looks right about the same. And even from up in the cheap seats up there, you see the shape of the data. It's fairly close to what we call a normal distribution, or a bell curve, if you will. And this is what standardized tests do, is they resist the forces that can, for example, skew a GPA distribution, things like grade inflation. And they consistently produce this set of results for colleges. So colleges have very mixed feelings about what test scores say about a student, but they can rely on this consistency, where nationally most students will score kind of in this thick part of the curve, 400 to 600 range. And we could debate what a high test score says about a human being, much less a 16-year-old specifically. But I would like to be the first to just assure you, if you had any doubt, it doesn't say a lot that really matters in the long term. All of us as adults could think of someone in our life that maybe was a good standardized test taker, but otherwise maybe has struggled for other reasons. Maybe work ethic, or street smarts, common sense, discipline, empathy, interpersonal traits, the ability to get along with other people, kindness, sense of humor. Okay? The SAT score gets at none of those things. And I know saying this to adults is an obvious thing to say. It's easy for a kid. Forgive me, those students here, to call you a kid for a minute, but in an environment like this one, getting a test score for the first time in 10th grade, and students are comparing, and you feel judged, it's easy to forget that it really is just a hurdle to clear, and then unless you go into my line of work, you probably don't think about it again. Okay? What we can't deny, though, about test scores is they have this function, this crude sorting mechanism, and the highest scores are rare. So whatever 750 plus means or doesn't mean, it's the most unique score in the applicant pool. Only about 2 to 3% of students nationally have a score at or above that level. So the currency it holds in the admission process is it gives colleges some rough context to consider alongside the transcript. And if all college applicants were coming only from schools that are as known and respected in the college admissions world as Berkeley, Carroll, there might be less need for tests like this. But at USC, where I worked in admissions for a while, we didn't need test scores necessarily as much from the schools that sent us many applicants every year. But what about the student who lives in upstate rural New York and doesn't go to a school with great counseling, and that school sends one application to USC a decade. In that context, maybe the scores are of some use. But they are awfully problematic is the point. Okay. So they also provoke a lot of angst. This actually is, for me, the most poignant of the various cartoons I often reference. Since I have a 14-year-old daughter, so when your daughter's upset, if you say to her, "Tell me what's bothering you," use your SAT words. Well, you do. You've got at best very bad timing. Okay? What does this reveal, though, about us as parents? Without exception, we're well-intentioned. We're trying to be helpful in this process and say the right things and do the right things. And some of our behavior, not just as testing, but college admissions generally, is definitely just driven by anxiety. And I appreciate that. We don't want to make tactical errors, or big blunders that are irrecoverable and that hold our kids back from opportunities they might otherwise have had. That's completely fair. Doesn't mean, though, that you can't take it too far. And I will make an argument tonight for attention given to these tests that's appropriate, smart, will be successful, but also is really surgical and also kind of done in moderation. And what we see in our practice, the clients we work with, far too often do we see families whose instinct is to do too much, to start too soon, and do too much with these tests for too long. And at best, in many cases, it's inefficient. It just was more time than it needed. And at worst, it can backfire. And it can, pull time that was precious away from something that would have been more important. Also, it's just a drag on the student's state of mind. And so there's this balance you really should be seeking as a family to give these tests their due, but not 1 second more than that. And some of the things I'm going to talk about will help you triangulate where that is. Just a brief comment on the admission competition and the test role. So I'm often, every year I'm asked, it seems like things are an all-time high fever pitch with the tests and so forth. And what you read, what you'll consume about college admissions does not help you. So a typical piece, New York Times article was titled High School Seniors Agony. So note the editorial decision to choose the word agony when there's lots about the college admission process that's wonderful. It's interesting and it's empowering and it's this big challenge you get to do as a family. There's lots about it that's great, and they chose agony. And some of the sentiments probably sound familiar in what you read about college. That competition creates intense worry, that it's never been so competitive, we hear that every year, and that what used to seem like a strong application no longer feels as competitive. I hear this even from parents with older kids off in college. This particular New York Times article that I'm pulling quotes from was written in 1957. So some of this is the same as it ever was. And think about the agenda in what you read and help your sons and daughters without becoming completely cynical about it. Read with a critical eye and know that back then that sold newspapers. Every fall the Times trotted out some version of this piece. Now it gets clicks. But the fact is, virtually every student, especially with professional help like you have here, finds a good home, finds a good place. I was talking with Carroll and Clea earlier and talking about the seniors, and I asked, are you homeless? Referring to they found they have an option for college, and they all do. So, okay, what you are really facing in 2019 with college admission testing is not helpful to talk about the competition in a general sense. It's always been competitive. What it is more complex. And with that comes more flexibility, but you have a lot of choices that you get to make, or depending on your perspective, have to make in how students navigate the college admission testing part of this process. And this has changed. I would wager that if you remember your own testing process, you probably didn't spend a lot of time thinking about SAT versus ACT. I'm positive your parents didn't go to a talk when you were in 10th grade and have some guy hand you a 100-page book about testing on the way in. Right? So some of this is, maybe complexity of our own making, but you have a lot of choices that student is really well served by making them correctly. So some of those are just very practical, and they boil down to test selection. So which test is the best test for you, SAT or ACT? This is one you want to get right, and you are, as of tonight, equipped to make that decision, the best possible choice for the student. So the school does something very intentional and progressive in bringing to students in 10th grade formal opportunities to sit for a practice SAT, a practice ACT, no stakes attached, purely for planning purposes, and you see what you have. And almost every student in 10th grade went through that for both tests. You have those reports from us. We've talked to some of you about them already, and you have enough information in your hands with that data and with the student's recollection of the experience to choose the best possible test for him or her. So that decision, why does that matter? You don't want to not think that through carefully or incorrectly, and then a year from now, late in 11th grade, already spend a lot of time grappling with one or both tests, realize I didn't spend my time the way that I should have. So part of what I can help tonight is say these are mistakes not to make. Don't spend all of 11th grade kind of spending equal time on both tests, bouncing back and forth, taking both tests multiple times, getting lured into test prep for both. A company offering a comprehensive package for both tests, that's a big red flag. They're not, acting in your interest. So if efficiency is a goal, at the beginning, correctly picking the best test for you and putting all of your energy behind that is a time saver. That's really the way to go. We have some students here tonight. Students, let me ask you a quick poll. How many of you in 11th grade expect to have unlimited amounts of time and energy for testing? There's always somebody. Okay, so he does. Okay. He's walking it back already. Yeah. So as a group of advisors, parents, and counselors trying to help students figure out the most streamlined ways through this is just smart. Then there's these specific questions. Do you need the essay that's attached to the test? What about subject tests in 2019? What is their relevance? How do you deal with those? And what do you make of the PSAT and this practice ACT right now? How much faith should you put in whatever it's projecting? And then on the back end, we get some tactical questions. A big one would be timing. I'm going to talk with some data about pros and cons of different starting points for dealing with these tests, and will help you think through what a calendar might look like. And then things like, what do colleges do at the end of the process when I'm applying, and I have scores? Do I have to show all of them, or can I hold some back, and what are the ramifications? We'll get into some of that as well. All right, one more silly cartoon. This is the rumor mill in action on this question of SAT versus ACT. This is not the silliest advice I've ever heard about this question. I've heard even worse. Let me just say, some of the generalizations you may hear, that a student who's a particular type of learner is better at this test or that test, or a student with a particular learning difference, this test or that test. None of that adds up. There's also no real link between academic strengths and a choice between the SAT or ACT. None of that holds water, and we find so many exceptions to these supposed rules that I don't even want to repeat the rules. So again, the process was to take these practice tests, fully digest what you have, and then make a decision. At a high level, here's what the 10th graders dealt with on these tests. So many of you are probably more familiar with the SAT, but none of you would have taken today's version, and in fact, it's changed 3 times significantly since I took it. So it is now a test that, for the most part, they've excised some of the just notoriously tricky stuff. If you remember an old SAT that you took with math problems that felt like logic puzzles, trying to trick you, and on the verbal side, a lot of it was just really directly vocab skills, analogies, and antonyms. A lot of that is now gone, and it's more like the ACT, where it is really a test of just reading, writing, and math in more of a straightforward way. However, it retains a lot of the things that bedevil students. It's one common experience on both tests is that it's a feat of endurance. At least 3 hours. You've got to really work at a brisk pace on something that is high stakes. You've got to keep your focus up for that entire period. If you add on the essay, it's about 4 hours. If you have extended time, great, 5 to 6 hours for you. Okay. So it's a marathon, and like any test like that, you don't go in cold. And part of the value of the test in 10th grade is steadily building up the endurance and some familiarity with what this experience will be like. Okay, that adds up and makes a difference. So the tests are both quite long. The differences can be subtle, but end up being really important in terms of how they impact students and the choice that they should make. So just a couple examples. Both tests have reading comprehension. The skill of quickly reading something that may be uninteresting to you, and it's fast-paced, and you've got to then answer questions on the clock that can be kind of fussy. And a classic situation would be answer choices that look very similar. So that's on both tests. The SAT, it kicks off the test. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, and you've got reading comp, and it's 65 minutes long. So long section. If you have extended time, great. Hour and 38 minutes for you to have reading comprehension to start your day. On the positive side, many students find that its pace feels very reasonable. You look at top left, you've got 65 minutes for 52 questions, so more than a minute per question. ACT, reading comes up 2 hours into the exam. Oops. So maybe now you're wide awake, or maybe now you're fading, depends on you. It is much, much shorter. ACT reading is only 35 minutes, so it's almost just half as long. The trade-off is 40 questions in 35 minutes means less than a minute per question. And almost every student will tell you the ACT pace tends to feel more brisk. I feel more rushed, hurried on the ACT. It may be worth it, but this is one of about a dozen trade-offs that we're evaluating. The math. ACT math, it's pretty straightforward in what it's doing. It comes up 1 hour into the test, It's 60 minutes, 60 questions, all multiple choice, calculator allowed. So the format doesn't feel unfamiliar. It's fast-paced, and if you get off stride, you've got to really race to recover, but it's not very mysterious. It also tends to be more straightforward in how it presents material. If you know the formulas, you know how to do that for that problem, you should be able to handle it. Okay? But it's quick. SAT math, there's more going on. It's split over 2 sections. Let's look at the last section first. 55 minutes of math, only 38 questions. So it, on the surface, looks not nearly as fast-paced as ACT math. Some students don't feel that. SAT, the general rule is they're often ask you to kind of read and evaluate more on the math before you get to solving a problem. So many students feel the pace of these two is pretty similar. It allows a calculator just like the ACT. However, before that, there's a little short SAT math section, just 25 minutes. It's really a race, 20 questions, so it's a fast pace also. And on that section, they throw the twist at you of not allowing a calculator, which for some students is really a foreign experience. So math skills are sometimes reflected differently on one test versus the other. Another subtlety. SAT hardly cares about geometry at all. There's hardly any of it on the SAT. ACT, geometry is more than a third of the test. So if you remember geometry and it was a strength, that sets you up a bit better for the ACT. If it was a weakness and you've tried to forget it, that's going to come back to bite you on the SAT. But they have a lot in common. Another subtlety. Let's say 2 things. Let's say that math is your weakness. It's not your strongest area. Let's also say that you get tired and worn down taking a 3 to 4 hour test. For you, the SAT, that may be a double whammy because the entire back half of the exam is all math. So you're fading and it's not what you like to do. Does that set up well? I could go on. There's a lot of topics, and the process, if you're trying to really be thorough, is to look at these practice test results and carefully go through all of these things with the student central in that discussion. Really listening to the student and her remembering her experience and trying to figure out which test is best suited. The English, which is like the writing and language on the SAT, these 2 sections have a lot in common. For many students, they end up being the most manageable section. Writing and language on the SAT, English on the ACT, very, very coachable. There's a finite list of rules being tested that you may not have learned in a very kind of rote way in school. You learn how a misplaced modifier works, how it can be kind of hidden within an oddly structured sentence. You quickly do better. So if your profile on these practice tests, the English or the writing and language was the lowest, that actually, the data tell us that's the position from which a lot of students improve fairly easily. For many students, the toughest section to improve easily in a short period of time would be the reading comp. And test prep teaches strategies for that, but it's not a lot of gimmicks. To really meaningfully improve your reading score, you're actually going to meaningfully improve your reading skills and your comprehension ability. You're also going to get faster. Really learn how to move more quickly through dense materials. These are some of the things that are going on. Last but not least, the science. Kind of an outlier on the ACT. It's a bit of a misnomer. As students, having taken the test, you could hopefully back me up on this. There's not that many questions where remembering actual facts from science classes make much of a difference. So that's not really what it is. What it is really is more reading comprehension. And it's on science-related material. So it could be, for example, the description of a scientific experiment. And you've got 2 different scientists' interpretation of the data. And you've got the data to look at yourself. And you're answering questions primarily about what is there. It wouldn't be so bad except the 3 things. The format is unfamiliar to students. It's at the end of the test when you're getting tired. And it's incredibly fast-paced. It's the same structure as reading with 35 minutes and 40 questions, but more information. So here's a takeaway. It is not unusual at all for students seeing the ACT for the first time to struggle to finish the science. So if you saw that on the practice test, don't be dismayed. That happens routinely. You overcome that. You learn how you can move more quickly, where you can cut corners. You get used to it. You build up endurance. You have more energy by the time that you get there. So I would not discard the ACT because you didn't like science at first. But if you can't get over it, you really hate it, maybe the SAT is the test for you. Nothing quite like it on the SAT. So this is some similarities and differences on these 2 tests. The essay is something that is bolted onto the end. It's optional. It's an essay you write by hand on a topic not given in advance. and then it's graded by human beings. Okay? Kalia once upon a time, a long, long ago. Okay? The good news is it's this really kind of stilted exercise, and it's about to die. Colleges generally don't care about it. There's very few that require it. I'll show you a list in a minute. I will tell you right now, a majority of our students still deal with it. Why? Because you don't want to be a 12th grader in the fall, thought you were done with testing, and then you decided to throw a school on your list that still recommends it. What does that mean? I wish I had it. Or if you want to apply to the UCs out in California, they explicitly require it still as of today, as does West Point. UCs and West Point, only selective colleges in the country that require it. I can make this really simple. The recommended list that's also highly selective colleges would be Duke, Stanford, and Amherst. That's it. There are others that soft recommend it, but not a lot do. So keep an eye on this as 10th graders. You may find 6 to 12 months from now, if the UCs step down, which they might, it may go entirely away, but right now you do have to decide if you're going to deal with it. If you are going to do it, minimal preparation would be appropriate. Just enough to see that you write to your potential and do decently enough that even at one of those schools I mentioned, it would be okay, fine. So it's really kind of a big nothing, but we have to talk about it. Okay, this chart is important, and this lets you compare scores using the same underlying concordance tables that colleges use. This is kind of a simplified extraction of it. On the online score reports that we sent to you, near the top of those reports was a tool that showed you, for you, if there was a clear winner. But this is where that data is coming from. And the way it works is you would compare scores. So say you had a practice ACT of the 22 and a PSAT or SAT of 1200. You'd use this like a grid. This is in your book. So you come over and down and see where these scores intersect. And in this case, the SAT is the better test for you. That is a clear win. If this were your profile, we would strongly recommend go with the SAT and forget about the ACT. We'd want to make sure that each test got roughly an equal effort from you, and want to hear if the student feels there's extenuating circumstances, but otherwise that's a better SAT score in terms of how colleges would look at the two. Another scenario, say you had a practice ACT of 31 and a practice SAT of say 1400, that's a tie. Those are equivalent scores as far as colleges are concerned. This is actually the more common scenario. The student takes practice tests and finds it's roughly a wash. That's when you dive into these other considerations and try to really figure out for you which test is preferable, or which one did you dislike less. Okay. Which one's the lesser evil, right? So some things to think about. Let me take just a moment and take you into one of the sections of one of the tests to give you more of a sense of what you pull out of these practice test reports. So we'll look at ACT math quickly because it's actually one of the most straightforward sections to understand. Content-wise, it surveys a lot of math going back to middle school. So pre-algebra is fair game. Goes up through Algebra 2 and Basic Trig, so if there were some concepts you hadn't seen yet on the practice test, that happens. And it just surveys a lot of math, and remember, it includes geometry, whereas the SAT largely does not. This way you have content-wise, it's pretty straightforward. It's the pacing where students get sideways. So students you might initially have looked at the structure of the math and saw, okay, 60 minutes, 60 questions, I guess I should spend a minute per question. In fact, that would be a terrible pace. You would not want to spend exactly a minute per question. Bad idea. Why? Because the questions start out statistically very easy and then are very, very difficult by design at the end of the test. And there's that progression. So students realize that and think, well, then I probably better hurry at the beginning because I'm going to need lots of time for these really hard questions at the end. That too can be a really bad idea. So what do? What you don't do is cherry pick. You kind of know based on where you are scoring and where you can hope to improve to, what would be the range of questions that give you the most bang for your buck. As a student put it to me the other day, you need to stay in your lane. Okay? So let me explain what that means. This is a heat map that shows the difficulty of questions cut by students' performance. So the ACT Math, 60 questions, we broke them up into thirds. This is data from several thousand students who had taken a number of different forms, but the common denominator is they were all first-time ACT takers like you probably were recently. Left to their own devices, what did students do? And the colors indicate difficulty in performance. So green would be statistically easy questions, almost everyone got right. Dark red, really hard questions everyone was getting wrong. And you see generally, but not perfectly or linearly, a progression from mostly green to yellow getting harder, orange fairly hard, red really difficult. It's not linear because students are students. And you're bringing some intuition to bear, you've got some ideas that maybe aren't quite right, lots of things going on, and you don't see students doing as well on the statistically easier questions as they should be and as they need to be. So here's some data that is probably the most important slide in terms of understanding your own score report. So think about this concept of percentage of possible points. And first, imagine that you're taking the multiple choice test with 5 answer choices, which is what ACT Math has, and you're told there's no penalty for a wrong answer, so you're going to at least guess. Let's say on this test with 5 answer choices per question, all you did was guess. Refused to, I don't want to be there that day and I'll show them, I'm just going to guess and take it out. If that were you, this purple horizontal line is kind of a baseline. 20% of the possible points from just random guessing alone is what you'd expect unless you're just a terrible guesser. Right? So here's a hard truth and a way to think about this. If you are not just guessing, you're reading the question carefully, trying, thinking about it, writing stuff down, trying to solve it, spending time. If you're doing all of that, but it's not increasing your odds of getting it right well above 20%, what are you doing? It's not good test taking. And we see that in students' scores. So let's look at how students did in 3 different groups. First, the students 30 and above. So as a group, here's how they did on the 60 problems on the test as a group. So number 1, statistically very easy question, they got 100% of the possible points as a group. Then as a group, you see some dips. So even these very strong math students, they're not perfect here, and quite honestly, if I'm being picky, they should be. If you are scoring in the 30s on the ACT, you have no business getting a question wrong in the first about 3/4 of the test. It's something that got away from you that didn't need to. Careless sounds harsh, but it's a mechanical error. You misread it. Common mistake is a student who correctly answered a question that wasn't being asked. That's nice, but that's not what it was actually asking you to solve for. You misscanned a calculator. You're just rushing. It's the accumulation of those errors that results in what is a very common profile of the students we work with. Easily in the mid to high 20s, capable of being well into the 30s, but it's not their math skills really that hold them back. There's things they need to relearn. And strategies will help them, but it's also just being meticulous and not letting anything get away that doesn't need to. Even these really high-scoring students, they're not doing much better than random guessing here at the high end. So it's these problems, though, that are the low-hanging fruit. So sometimes the path to improvement for a student in this range is to first slow down and say, I'm going to have even less time for these hardest questions. And that can be, a blow to your ego. But the stages would be to first slow down and learn how to be perfect where you should be. And once you're getting everything right that you're supposed to, and you can build speed back up without sacrificing accuracy, great. Then we have time to go and attack these. But that's like step 3 or 4, not step 1. Okay? These kids will be all right though. Okay, these are some of the top percentile scores. Look at the red. So here, these are students in this 23 to 29 range, and they, on the final half a dozen or so questions on the test, they're just treading water. Time spent there is not helping them. Same general rule applies. If I have a 25 on the ACT, the first 35 or 40 questions, statistically for me, should be in my wheelhouse. I should be able to get most, if not all, of those right, and that's where I make or break my score. The hard truth students must accept, at least initially, is with the 25, these questions are not they're not for me. They are there to discriminate between who's a 31 and who's a 35. I'm trying to get from 25 to say 30. If and when I get there, then I set a new goal. But for now, it's again staying in your lane and where are the problems where your odds are the best, where the time invested is the smartest. Okay? So some things to think about when we're looking at scores. Last but not least, students in this high teens to low 20s range. Speaking kind of bluntly, all the time spent here is just wasted. It's a washout. It's the final 15 to 20 questions is just break even versus guessing. It's actually worse, though, than just lost time. Because if you're taking a standardized test that's high stakes, you would know if you're getting one after another wrong. You could feel that, and it's a bummer. That's demoralizing, and you're going to take that with you to the next section. It's just not necessary. The good news is, if I have a 20, 22 on the ACT, a lot of the test is going to be very, very difficult, but about half of the questions I'm actually supposed to get right. They're designed so they should be accessible to me. So if I had 1 minute to talk to a student with this profile in the blue, who then had to take the test the next day, I might tell them the following. I might say, slow way down, and I'd be specific. Take 59 minutes for the first 40 questions. And I'm still stretching him, giving him room to improve, but slowing him way down, and he can and he will do better on those questions, given more time, a little bit less stress. And I tell him, save 1 minute to just guess in the last 20 questions, pick your favorite. And I say it in a way that's not glib or unkind, but that would immediately be a more successful experience for that student to feel a lot better. Okay? So the takeaway is simply that what does a test score say about you? Actually, by the way, let me just quickly comment on one of the other sections. So math, the questions are organized biserially is the nerdy word, an ascending difficulty, and that never fails. The SAT, they are as well. ACT English, let me show you that heat map. You see a pattern here? There's 75 questions. You do see a bit more red and orange in the final third of the test. That's solely due to students fatigued, running out of time. Statistically, the raw difficulty of those items in the final third, same mix of easy, medium, and hard as in the first third of the questions. So everything I just said about the ACT math does not apply to the ACT English. Here, you want to pace yourself really perfectly evenly so that you have time at the end of that section to see and spend time on the statistically easiest questions. So every section of every test has its own set of little rules, none of which are rocket science to learn. You don't have to pay for expensive tutoring to pick up anything I've said so far. It's in this book. It's on different websites. Practice tests to really work at it are readily available. So it doesn't have to be an arms race, but I do feel, I'm not being a shill for test prep, but some form of practice will be reflected in your score. This is not a score that's just this reflection of something innate. It's like anything else. It's something that you've worked at. And so what does a test score say about you? Some of it is content knowledge. If you have forgotten all of geometry and you've chosen the ACT, you've got to relearn it. You need to know it. Test prep companies act like it's all about the tricks. And we've got these really unique methods. We just show them to you and off you go, your score skyrockets. And that's disingenuous. That's not how it works either. However, from some form of test prep, even self-prep, from a good website or book, you should pick up a method for whatever you're going to encounter, which might be a bit different or a lot different than what you would do on that topic in school. So ideally, what test prep is doing is really completely demystifying what you're doing. Everything you see, you've got a plan. It may be, I skipped those, but you know exactly why. Okay? So that's part of it. A big piece for me that is part of your score is how well did you know what you're doing with time management? Did you take the test perfectly? Doesn't mean you got a perfect score, but it meant that for you, every second invested was as it should be. And there's very much an emotional component to this as well. We have some students who are too undisciplined or careless or even unmotivated or lazy in their approach to this, but they're few and far between. Far more commonly, we have students who are just too hard on themselves and bring a tremendous amount of anxiety to this, understandably. And for them, getting that under control to a level where it's manageable and not self-defeating is part of their improvement. And a lot of that comes from, and I'm a broken record on this, practice tests. Just practice tests and getting familiar and knowing exactly what it's going to look and feel like and what you'll do at every scenario makes a big difference. If these bottom two things go together, tell me this sounds like you or your son or daughter. She's taking the test. And she, like almost every student, will run into some problem she doesn't know how to do. But that happens to everybody unless you're 1% perfect scores. So that happens. You know some of what's going on, so you can quickly narrow it down to C or D. You do things you've been taught or have learned, and you narrow it down C or D. Now you're stuck. So far you've invested 30 seconds. You have a choice. Do you let yourself off the hook and just guess on what's left and keep it moving? Or do you sit there and stare at it for 45 seconds, frustrated, mad at yourself? Okay? And then finally, grudgingly guess and move on, but it's still lingering. Okay? Then you do that 5 or 6 more times on those questions where you can't perfectly solve it, times the 4 sections of the test. And this stuff is part of what is reflected in your score. So as a family, as parents, helping figure out what form of preparation, what degree of it, how much intensity, over what period of time, how it's thought about, how it's discussed in your home, all of this is operating. And ultimately, students do their best when these kind of levers are pulled in different ways, different amounts, and that's when a student scores to her potential. But scores are volatile, and you routinely see, this is why colleges, I think, mostly take them with some grain of salt. It's easy to throw off a score that a college should interpret as a false negative. That's what I was talking about at USC and Caltech, is what are the circumstances that result in a score not actually being a good reflection of what the student is capable of? One of the most common situations would be a student who lacks resources and guidance and support. Who doesn't, the parents don't go to a talk like this, and they don't have a tutor, and they're trying to figure it out. So those scenarios, you often see students with false negative scores that don't reflect their ability. For better or worse, though, what these tests are pretty good at doing is not throwing off false positives. You can't trip and stumble and get a 780 on the reading. Whatever that means, you earned it. Okay? So sometimes testing is a process to work through avoiding false negatives and putting it all together on one day. And practice tests help you do that. What degree of improvement is realistic? Some more data here. So this is the distribution of ACT scores. I showed you the SAT a little while ago. And here's the percentile curve overlaid. So the 50th percentile in the ACT nationally is around 2021. And the question is, what gains are realistic on this test? And I have data. Okay, I'm not impartial here. I own a tutoring company. So what am I going to say? But you can improve your score. You really can, at least within a band. So here's a scenario. Say a student is starting with a 19. That would be nationally the 44th percentile. So is that good or not? It's entirely relative to where you hope to apply. And there's the early part of the book, there's half a dozen pages that show you the stats at a lot of well-known colleges. What I think is helpful is to think about a percentile as a competitive field. So if you're at the 44th percentile, here's you, here's the students you're ahead of, here's the students ahead of you. A realistic goal for most students in this situation would be to try to cut the field ahead of them in half. On a percentile basis, here's what that looks like. You're improving to the 73rd percentile if you were cutting the field in half, and that would require going, in this case, from a 19 to a 24. Okay? If you remember the ISCE fondly, the Stanines would be like going from a 5 to a 6, maybe a 5 to a 7. Right? In the college admissions context, that's significant. That's kind of a different playing field. Probably more doors might open. And I'm here to, that is pretty commonplace. 5-point gain in the ACT composite, that's like 150 points on the SAT. Fairly routine for students who work at it. Not automatic, you have to work at it, but that gain is there to be had for most students. Here's the hard truth though, and I think I'm most helpful I just speak plainly. A 19 to a 34, pretty unheard of, regardless of what a test prep brochure might say. That just rarely happens. If it does, it was some really unusual set of circumstances. So the hard truth part is that you can't, with these tests, the way maybe you can academically, you can't say, I will do whatever it takes to score X. That is just the wrong mentality. It can be a recipe for heartache. Okay? I think the right attitude is to start with the positive assumption that there is improvement to be had. I, as a student, or I, as a student's parent, I want to see, I want to reach my potential in these tests, whatever that may be. And in the same breath, you should be thinking, and I want to do that as efficiently as possible. That's, to me, is the ideal test prep experience. I got the gain that I could potentially see. I got it with as little effort as was required, because I've got better things to do. Okay? So, I can't tell you exactly where that ceiling is, but in our context, we see it when it comes. The practice test trend, the student's feedback, the parent's intuition, we all tend to know when the student is now butting up against a soft ceiling. And at that point, diminishing returns are kicking in. And any further effort flung at this test is going to yield marginal additional benefit, if any. in an environment where the student doesn't have unlimited amounts of time and energy to do it. Now you have this is a parenting call, okay? And you got maybe a voice on one shoulder that's saying, you know what, let's take it again, one more time, a third round of testing or prep, you never know, maybe one more point. When really it's the other voice, other shoulder you should listen to, which maybe is saying, you know, you should now say to your child, forgive me students, you know what, great job, you're done. You worked hard at this is fine. You've improved, counselors are telling you you're in fine shape. Something else that you'd rather do with your time, I hope so, we're walking away, great job, call it a day. Okay? That moment will come, that walk away point from testing. It'll probably come in the second half of 11th grade or sometime then summer, early fall of 12th. And we spent a lot of time with families trying to talk this through, figure it out, and it's one of those many questions in tonight's talk. There's not a black and white answer of when enough is enough. But if you're at least asking the question, have we done enough, but not too much, then I think your head's in the right place. Another scenario, say the student has a 29, that's the 91st percentile. In this case, the field ahead of her is not very large, and cutting it in half would mean going to the 95th percentile, which would be a 31. That might be meaningful. In a lot of cases, we would be a bit more ambitious than that, try to push that score higher into the 30s, and in most cases that would be realistic. But here, the truth is, a 29 to a 36 is pretty rare. Maybe 1 in 20 students. 29 to 33, not terribly unusual. So sometimes what we see is just unproductive trophy seeking. Student taking the test a third time, at best there's one incremental point. They're already in the 98th, 99th percentile. Colleges should not, and I believe most do not, split hairs, when your scores are that high. Nor should colleges be treating these thresholds like they're meaningful, like above 1,400, below 1,400. One of the things I was doing at USC and Caltech was really looking at the science of the test and the stats. There's something called the standard difference, if you remember from a college statistics course, which says in a case like this, you are not supposed to conclude that two students have actual meaningful differences in ability unless their scores are actually fairly far apart. On the ACT, more than 2 points. On the SAT, more than 80 points. Inside that range, what you have is statistical noise. You're not supposed to conclude at any confidence interval that these kids have different levels of ability. And yet, it sometimes feels like colleges, Vanderbilt says, we really want a 33. Well, 32 is effectively the same score, And there are some colleges that actually do have cut scores sometimes for scholarships. When there are white papers published by the College Board and ACT saying don't do that. Okay. But generally, I think most colleges, I'll give you a quote. Years and years ago, Dean of Admission at USC, Joe Allen, who's passed away, really towering figure in our work back then, in a training session with his staff. I was a lowly intern. He said something I always remember. He said, we need these scores. We have, now USC has 60-some thousand applicants from 140 countries and 10,000 different high schools. So he said, we need these scores, but sometimes we need to hold our nose while we use them. And he was talking about all the ways that they're problematic, some of which I've already mentioned. And he said, we must appreciate they are not precise. They're a data point, but it's not something we want to be overthinking. Right? And I think generally, a lot of the college admissions world shares that philosophy, but sometimes it will feel like, gosh, another point or two would make a difference. It just depends. So that's some perspective on how the scores work. Let me finish off by running through some really quick-hitting questions about college policies. So we'll go back to our list of questions and hit kind of the right side here. So first, I thought a good way to do this, here is a frame of reference, 50 colleges. And I dare say you've heard of maybe all of them or nearly all of them. Okay? It would be hard to find any two colleges on this list that had the exact same testing requirements or recommendations or nuance. So there's a lot of diversity in what colleges require. So I'm going to quickly run through some questions on which there's not consensus. So first, a question of, do you even need the scores at all? There are now more than 1,000 colleges that do not even require an SAT or ACT for you to be considered for admission. There can be some caveats in there, but they're out there. Out of these 50, here are the ones that are officially test optional. And this, by the way, pages 7 and 8 in the book goes into more depth on this topic. You see some very, very competitive colleges here. A year ago, University of Chicago joined this group. Impossibly low admission rate, very, very selective. What's going on here is these are colleges that are, it's part of a social justice movement. Colleges looking critically at their processes and what are the high hurdles most daunting or confusing for students who don't have resources or who are just underrepresented in higher education. And they're saying, do we need to really require that? And do we have enough data from transcripts and other things to make good decisions in those cases? The trade-off isn't worth it to require scores of all students. And for the most part, the test optional movement, again, more than 1,000 colleges now, so about a third of four-year schools do not require the test explicitly. And it has started to move the needle on more colleges being more accessible to students from underserved backgrounds, which is wonderful. It's also helpful for the colleges. You know, they don't have to see or report scores from students who would not have been competitive. So it kind of keeps that out of the mix. But here is a sense of, within this pool, those that are and are not. I would simply say about test optional, and you would certainly be getting advice from the counselors along these lines. If test scores for you are never going to be your best foot forward, it's just always a relative weakness in your profile, I would look that much harder and longer at the test optional world. You have some schools on your list. But ultimately, you have more places that will consider you if you've been able to take tests and do your best. There's this quirky group called test flexible schools. This one's in yellow. NYU is on the list. They're explained on page 9. They are colleges that do require tests of some kind, but they give you a longer menu to choose from. You wouldn't have to choose the SAT or ACT at all to apply to NYU. You could stand just on other tests, like subject tests. So they're an outlier, they're in the mix. In this group here, these ones in red do require the SAT or ACT. They're not yet at least test optional. So this just gives you some sense of perspective. Okay, very quickly, this question of do you need the essay? I already mentioned this earlier. Vast majority of these 50 truly don't care. And we have, by the way, this is a sampling, but we have the complete list in our handout. So in this case, it's pages 48 to 53. So the green don't care. The ones in yellow, quote unquote, recommend. I don't even think they care either. But do you want to apply to Stanford and have had something that was explicitly recommended but you didn't do it? Probably not. Okay. And then the UCs, again, along with West Point, are the real outliers that are both selective and that still require it. And they may be dropping it within a year or two. So right now, I mean, you know, as 10th graders, should you take the essay when you do your test formally next year? It checks the box. Better to have it than not need it, but boy, I sure wouldn't spend a lot of additional time on it. Fair? Okay, good. Do you have to send all your scores? You've taken the test more than once. You're applying to college a year and a half from now. Must you report all of your scores? It depends. The majority of colleges allow you to exercise what is called score choice, where the colleges in green fully endorse it. They let you hold back a test date if you don't want to show it. We'll never see it. The colleges in light green have soft language discouraging score choice. They still allow it as well. So any shade of green on the screen allows score choice, allows you to say, hold back the April test date and only report the later test date. Great. Some colleges don't, or partially restrict it. So these ones in orange, common flavor of this would be to say, you choose between the SAT and ACT, but then you report all of the tests that you focused on. Okay? And there's always an outlier, and often it's Georgetown when it comes to testing. They forbid score choice. You, on Georgetown's application, you sign a statement that says, I have not exercised score choice, I've reported everything. Why? You know, I don't think even Georgetown is actually trying to find meaning in trends of scores. How did they know? You know, you weren't feeling well, or you were in 9th grade and took a flyer on a subject test. You know, it shouldn't be held against you. But I would just say there are a handful of colleges that will discourage or prohibit score choice. So to me, it's just one more positive incentive to not overdo testing. And I also would say, don't go rack up official test dates that are effectively just serving as practice tests. Do that. We use official tests, but it's not on your record. Okay. Another question, are scores combined across dates? We call this super score. So here's a scenario. Say you took the test twice, And very commonly, your scores are lumpy. So April, you peaked in math and reading. In September, you peaked in English and science. But you didn't put it all together on one day. Colleges that super score would recalculate a composite, and they kind of mix and match. Great. Okay? It's not a universal thing, though. So within this group of 50, there's a complete list on pages 76 and 77. The ones in green fully super score. So if those colleges are on your list, you do not have to peak across the board on one day. These ones in yellow inexplicably super score the SAT but not the ACT. No reason for this. Long ago, the ACT used to discourage super scoring of their test. 8 years ago, they released a research paper that said, haha, just kidding. Actually, they're talking to colleges, you should super score, that's the recommended practice. And yet a lot of them still don't. Why does that matter? If you chose the ACT for your test, a bit more pressure on you to peak across the board on one date if these kinds of schools are on your list. Okay? And again, there's always outliers. Some colleges don't super score at all. Now, no colleges average you down, not even Georgetown. At worst, they'll take your best score from one sitting, but not all of them mix and match. And some do it from one test, but not the other. Is that confusing? Yeah, okay. Stay tuned. All right, do you need subject tests? This one has a lot of nuance, and I ultimately defer to your in-house experts and who know your situation the best. Subject tests used to be called SAT 2s. Before that, they were achievement tests back when I took them in the early 90s. Here's what they are. This is the menu. So much more academically focused tests tied to certain subjects. They're an hour long. They're not the same as AP or IB exams. Not the same. Not quite as rigorous, not as long, and not as tied to a particular defined curriculum. Meant to be more accessible. Do you need them is the question. But if you do, you're generally trying to come up with two. Which two is your choice, except for certain cases, which I'll get to. There's always exceptions. And do you need them or not is the big question. If you do, you'll take them at the end of the school year, typically, when you had the class that most closely corresponds. Sometimes 9th and 10th graders take these. More often, if you take them at all, it's at the end of 10th, end of 11th grade. But here is, in this group of 50, here's who cares and who doesn't care. There are 4 colleges out of this group that don't care at all. They're silent on subject tests, these 4 in dark green. Then there's that outlier pool, the flexible colleges. Do they require subject tests? No. Subject tests are just on the menu of choices. Okay, so they're, again, a separate group. These ones in yellow take kind of this soft position of, well, we'll consider subject tests. They kind of leave it at that. I think they take pains to not use the word recommend, but they kind of expect you to read between the lines. Stanford is on the, we'll consider, but we don't require subject tests. I'm getting over a cold, excuse me. I know that's true because we've gotten students, been involved in students who got into Stanford without subject tests. They were usually recruited athletes, so I think there's just different things going on. But it's just the wrong mentality to look at a place with a 4% admission rate and say, what are the minimum requirements? It's more, what can I do within reason to show the strongest possible portfolio? Doesn't mean you should go crazy and try to take 5 subject tests, but generally you want to be opportunistic. So your classes that are advanced and that are strengths for you, you'd want to consider taking the corresponding subject test if you're looking at some of these, especially selective colleges. The ones here in orange use the word recommended in some specific way. So Harvard, Dartmouth, Duke, the exact language I think is subject tests are not required if taking them would present a financial hardship for you. So it's kind of like the test option movement. They're signaling that if you are in the overrepresented pool within our applicant body, taking subject tests is typical. And then they leave it to you to decide what to make of that. End of the day, though, there's only 4 colleges left that require subject tests, and Cornell, it's only for certain majors. So there's only 3 colleges that, without exception, require subject tests of all applicants. That's Harvey Mudd, MIT, and Caltech. What do they have in common? Renowned for their engineering programs. They want to see math and science subject test. Quite frankly, that's not too big a deal for students who realistically have a shot at a Caltech. Okay? They're in the most advanced math and science classes in their school. They do very well in them, so kind of takes care of itself. Here are subject test policies. This is in the books. I'll be very brief, but you've got to plan carefully. You can't take them on the same day as the SAT, nor would you want to. You need to take them at the right time that aligns with your schoolwork. There is still a guessing penalty. They're out of 800. And what creates the most confusion is their really unique pool. So I talked earlier about using percentiles to think about SAT and ACT scores. Don't do that for subject tests. Subject tests, the question of what is a good score is entirely relative to the pool and to where you're applying. So here is the distribution of subject test scores nationally for the Math 2 exam. It's the higher level math that corresponds with pre-calculus. This is not a normal distribution. The scores really pile up in the 750 to 800 range. Why is that? It's a small self-selected pool of kids who are good at this math. If we let the score range run out to say 1100, you would get a normal distribution. That's what it would look like, but that's just not the case. So here's a scenario. Is a 740 on the Math 2 a good subject test score? Depends. Say you're applying to a school where subject tests were only recommended, not required. Let's say you were applying as a humanities major, and math wasn't what you were saying. That's what I'm best at. And let's also say that your 740 Math 2 was higher than, let's say, your SAT Math of 690. In that context, I think a Math 2 is likely to help. It could be additive. If you're applying to Caltech, a 740 on the Math 2 might be what keeps you out, or it'd be a blemish, because at Caltech, the median Math 2 score is 800. Okay? I mean, that's not actually surprising. If you think about anybody serious about hoping to be admitted to Caltech, probably is really good at pre-calculus. So context is king in all of this stuff. And for subject tests, here's a simple rule. How does your subject test score compare to your SAT or ACT scores? If it's similar or higher, it's almost certainly additive. If it's lower, probably not. And I think a bar for subject tests generally, there's so few colleges left that care about them at all, and they're all very selective places. Subject tests generally, you want to be in the 700s, or they're probably not going to be adding a lot, or you're probably maybe swimming in the wrong pool. Okay? So this is some context about subject tests. I'm going to finish up by very quickly talking about calendaring. So if you look at where you are, the end of 10th grade, soon will be, all the way through the fall of 12th grade, here's all the tests you could take. Mike, I'm glad you're laughing. My goodness, don't do that. Okay, that would be crazy. I've seen it attempted, poor kid, but not what you want to do. I'll give you two really specific pieces of advice. Number one, we know, the data tell us that developmentally, most students will not peak on these tests until this window, the second half of 11th grade, the fall of 12th grade. We have data on that. Okay? Now, yes, there are exceptions. Students who are just very strong test takers, national merit level on the PSAT, like near perfect scores, take it early if you want, knock it out early, fine. They, even in a place like this, they're a small minority. Okay? So most students need the maturation and development of 11th grade before they're likely to peak. So if you start by accepting that reality, then you think about what preparation you might do. For a lot of students, if you're just trying to be super efficient, leveraging it against when the student's most likely to peak anyway, it's just smart. Okay? What you do academically in 11th grade, you're going to be a year older than you are now. All of that operates and underlies your score. Cross-cutting that, though, some students feel, or families feel like, well, we don't want to wait that long. We want to get an early start on this. We want to take advantage of the summer before 11th grade when we maybe have less distractions. So that can make sense, but if all you cared about was efficiency, you would wait until closer to a test date when maturationally you're more likely to peak. Okay? The second piece of advice I would say is specialize. So don't give equal amounts of time to both tests. Pick one or the other as we've been describing. So let's say you chose the SAT. So this is the frame when your best scores are likely to come. Let's now build up a testing calendar from scratch very quickly. So first fill in the pieces that you might need. And forgive me, are APs a thing here? No. All right, good. Okay, we'll ignore that one. It's helpful at the beginning to think about the end. So think about what test date might be your fallback position should you need it. And that might be the October test of 12th grade. Pushing up against early decision deadlines is a little bit tricky, but it's there if you need it. Filling in other pieces, you've got the PSAT October of 11th grade. Might have a subject test at the end of 10th grade. We use practice tests to help students figure out if that's a good idea. We're doing a lot of that right now. More likely if you have subject tests there at the end of 11th grade. And then what's left is to fill in your first SAT. For a lot of students, the March test date of 11th grade would make a lot of sense. The December is also very popular. The fall, October of 11th grade test is also fairly popular with 11th graders, but often for not good reasons. It's just you're anxious generally want to get going. But I will tell you, the data tell us, very few students post a score early fall of 11th grade that is a peak score that they end up wanting to send to colleges. Most at that point, if they're testing that early, it's practice testing effectively. Okay? So this time, this plan, looking at the time frame I've been talking about, I call the traditional testing approach. You're not starting too early, you're not starting too late. It would be nice to post scores in spring of 11th grade that has you feeling done, but you're open to the possibility of needing to take it early 12th if necessary. It's kind of a smart hedge. Okay? In this scenario, sometimes preparation starts the summer before 11th grade, but it doesn't absolutely need to. You got a lot of time. This is no longer the most popular plan amongst our clients. Now it's become, the last 5 years, early testing, early everything. Right? This is marked by families saying two basic things. One is we want to do a lot before 11th grade. We want to really load up and try to get this out of the way as early as possible. These are students who are typically taking the test fall of 11th and absolutely trying to be done by the end of 11th grade. Great if it's realistic. But for the students for whom it's not, who are dragged into it, or maybe sometimes it's a student pulling themselves into it, it's often, again, at best inefficient, at worst counterproductive. Right? So don't be on that train unless it makes sense for the right reasons. And a lot of families, it's become a hybrid of these two. Some summer work to lay the foundation and to lighten the pressure during 11th grade. But the key thing to me is do not let attention given to testing and test prep interfere with getting 11th grade off to a great start academically. And making sure there's room in your life to breathe and to be engaged in activities that you're passionate about 11th grade. That holds more currency in the college process. The tests, that can come. No one does this plan anymore, deferred testing. It used to be fairly popular. When I first started tutoring 25 years ago, I was a freshman at USC. All of my first round of students were fall 12th graders doing test prep for the first time. Can you imagine? Okay. You know what? A lot of them worked out great. A lot of them were boys. I have a daughter and son, so I can say this. Boys oftentimes just maturing later. For them, by then, it was really imminent. They knew the need for it. All 11th grade was under their belt, and it worked. But yet no one does it anymore. Right? So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Part of the reason I'm here is there's not just a to-do list that Carolyn and Kalia can give you that's the same for everybody. These are questions that you're trying to figure out. And ideally this talk is trying to kind of elevate your understanding so that as you finalize these plans, you're better informed. I've talked at length about practice tests. We had 2 of them here at school. More practice tests as you need them are readily available. We offer them. There are many other good companies that do the same. You can skip test prep companies entirely and get them on your own. But you need to make practice tests central in the planning process, and then any form of prep, even self-prep, practice tests are a big deal. We do proctored supervised tests at least once a weekend in our office in Chelsea. We also, every Saturday and Sunday, offer an online proctored virtual environment just to give students more options. Why does that help? You have an appointment and somebody's supervising, it's more likely that it gets done. Or you can self-administer tests that we would provide and score for you. And we're not alone. There's many offerings out there. So use practice tests. And on the reports that we sent you, one thing I want to call your attention to, a really helpful tool inside that report, even if you're doing self-prep, would be a section called Similar Scores, where for every section of each test, we show you problem by problem how students at your exact same score level, so we're leveraging a pool of thousands of students' data, how you did on a problem compared to the students at the same score level. So what this does for you is it shows you what are the problems that you're missing that are out of character for students like you. That's obviously where your attention should be directed first. That's the statistically low-hanging fruit you can get back. On the report, the really hard questions that you got wrong, maybe those you don't beat yourself up over. That's not your first priority. Okay? This is just one of the things that's in these reports that's meant to be really useful. Okay. Ways that we can help. On the left side, various things that we can do. The only thing that we're charging for would be proctored testing, there's a fee, and then of course private tutoring in home or online. On the right, various ways to reach us. That card, if you fill it out, here's what will happen, what will not happen. We're not going to bother you. You'll get about an email a month keeping you informed of what's going on with the world of testing. In many cases, we already have your email addresses because of the practice tests. So leaving a card with us with your phone number is telling us you'd like to hear from me or my colleague Anne-Marie Chan, the director of the New York office. And we'll call and happy to talk to you about the tests and how we can help, but zero obligation, not a sales pitch, or here to help if we can be. So feel free to leave that if you care to. I will leave you with my all-time favorite testing cartoon. I love this one. This guy is at the pearly gates, and he's dismayed, horrified to find out his test scores still matter. Okay? It's meant to be ridiculous. Yeah, these scores matter until they don't. And I said earlier, the real trick as a family, as a parent, is to give the test their due. Be smart about it, but try consciously, not 1 second more, and then I think you're doing right by your son or daughter. That's free advice from the parent of an 8th grader. Hope it helps. All right. It was really great to be here. I'll stick around and take questions for those of you who want to hear others' questions. If you've had enough of testing for one evening, I get it. Just maybe disperse quietly. But I'll repeat questions for those who want to hear others folks' thoughts, and Anne-Marie and I will stick around. Thank you for having me, and thanks again to Carroll and Cleo for putting this together.
Which of the schedules did you recommend?
The total depends on the students.
Well, you said there was the most popular, that it seemed like you didn't recommend the most popular.
I would more often recommend the traditional approach, deferring a bit more to 11th grade.
So the end of 11th grade and the beginning of 12th grade is your statistically.
I gotta know, I won't give you a general answer, it depends. If you call us and you say we're eager to get started, scores are middle of the road, and we don't want to overspend, but we're not too budget restrained. What you often end up doing with us would be a modest amount of foundational work the summer before 11th, but the real push spring of 11th, or winter of 11th. If the student is in no particular hurry, and your goal is just to minimize the effort and the expense attached to this, that's often wait until further to 11th grade and do it when it's primed against the student's development. Again, most of our clients, at least a majority, want to start early and do a lot early. And we're often kind of gently saying, are you sure? And should we think about this? So there's just no rule of thumb.
But you did say statistically one of them was better. Which one was better?
Later one.
The beginning of...
Well, here's the point. If I said that I misspoke, because here's what the data tells, and I think it's fascinating. Although that deferred approach is now very rare, the data has not changed. Most students still don't peak until the end of 11th or early 12th grade, despite everyone jumping on the hamster wheel earlier.
Okay, so based on what you said,
you don't automatically get better results by starting earlier.
Right.
The only thing I know for sure if you start early is you'll probably prep for longer. That's great for tutoring companies.
Is there any benefit to prepping longer?
Sometimes, sure, there's benefit to prepping longer, but many families' tendency and some tutoring companies' motivation is to drag it out. And I really think that the test prep done smart is surgical. And it's a treatment when the student's best prepared to benefit from it, and it doesn't have to be a 12 to 18 month proposition. I want to give you an answer. Most of our students, if they're really trying to be efficient and their scores aren't already sky high, they would prep over 2 to 3, maybe 4 months, do about a lesson a week. It'd be scheduled around everything else, and they'd get the results that are there without it being, interfering too much. Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So you said that, like, for instance, Chicago and Bowdoin opted out of testing, but they require subject testing, is what you said? So
no, they don't require. So Bowdoin's been test optional forever. University of Chicago, this is their first year.
Oh, okay.
Chicago, when they announced that they were going test optional, they were very transparent in their press release. They said why they were doing this, but they said we still expect to and frankly prefer to receive scores from most applicants. We've just seen some early numbers. Chicago is still getting test scores from most applicants, and they're, as they always have been, extremely high. Chicago does not require subject tests, but they get subject tests from a lot of their applicants. Yeah, so it's just reading between the lines that I think is important.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
that's,
Say you're in that judgment call zone on your diagram there,
Yeah.
the SAT and the ACT, and performance was flipped between the math and English on one, like, you know, higher performing on math on one, lower on the other, exactly flipped on a content basis on
Yeah.
the other test. Is that a meaningful interpretation?
yeah, that's an interesting case that happens. Are we talking about you? You know, what you might do is talk to the student about on which area does she feel like she has more potential to improve? Which area would be less of a grind to do so? We can tell you the pattern of your mistakes. Here's the one for us that looks more easily addressable, if that's the case. But I refer heavily to a student's own intuition in a case like that. Yeah, and that's common to have these lumpy, contradictory scenarios. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
I remember you saying on the SAT and the ACT about how in the math section the questions would get harder as time goes on. Is that the same for the what's it called?
Subject test.
The subject test, yeah.
On some of them, yes, that's true for the math too. It's not true for the literature. It's test by test. And on the SAT and ACT, I didn't get into the science and the reading. They have their own rules. So in this book, so I'm sure you're going to read cover to cover, there's a middle section. We explain how difficulty works inside of each test on a section by section basis. Science is really confusing. You may have noticed this. The science, there were 6 passages in that 35 minutes. The questions within each passage got harder, and the passages at the end were themselves the hardest. So the difficulty is not linear, or it's kind of a sawtooth pattern. It's kind of escalating as you go. Okay? That write-up is in the book, but the point is you're asking the right question. It's in a scenario of limited time, where do I get the most bang for my buck? Where should I make sure I've spent enough time? Yeah. Yes?
So in the context of the test optional schools, you
Yeah.
mentioned that it was part of a social justice
Mhm.
trend, and then later, I think when you were talking about subject matter tests, you said that the failure to submit or the decision not to submit or take a subject matter test might be considered by some schools in the context of other aspects.
Absolutely.
Is
And
that true? Is that true of the ACT and SAT optional scenarios too?
I mean, by all means, jump in here. But generally, I think a lot of colleges kind of know that if you went to a school like this, where certainly you're hearing about and plenty of resources around these tests, and you're choosing not to submit, then maybe you felt that it wouldn't have been a strong part of your application. They don't know for sure. Maybe you just made it as a values decision, said, I'm not going to deal with this. And a lot of colleges would respect that, but they don't necessarily know. But the general assumption would be that if you apply to a competitive place that does not require scores, and you chose not to submit, you probably had scores that you just felt wouldn't add anything. Yeah. I don't believe that's held against you, but I think colleges kind of know what's going on. You are saying, I think the other parts of my application better reflect my strengths and are what make me compelling. Yeah. I could show you, give you editorials to read that would take drastically different viewpoints on that. And some colleges would really resent what I just said. That they assume scores are low, they would insist otherwise. I'm not sure I fully believe it. Okay. Yes?
So the matrices that you showed are definitely a little confusing in terms of what schools are accepting what tests, what's optional,
Yes.
what's not. How often are the schools changing their protocols for accepting these tests?
I should have mentioned it. The point of all those colors were to really emphasize it is confusing and there's not consistency, and ultimately
Right.
you have to do the research.
Right.
For every topic that was on the screen, we have a dedicated resource in the book, and then for some topics, to your point, they are evolving. So on each of those questions, there is a list on our website we keep updated in real time of who super scores and who doesn't. Who requires subject tests and who doesn't, who requires the essay. I will make sure we email you direct links. You can save that email and you've got the direct access to the policies. The point is, as a student's college list starts to finalize,
Right.
you want to make sure you know each school's idiosyncrasies.
Right, but are they changing so frequently that you have to make smarter decisions on things like subject matter tests or
I think the
optional
dust
parts?
is mostly settled with subject tests.
Okay.
But the season when policy changes are announced tends to be now, for this time of year for rising seniors.
Right. Okay.
But if anything, what you could expect is that policies are going to be relaxed. I'm hard pressed to think of a college that's recently added a more stringent testing policy.
Okay.
So if you go by today's rules, at best you're going to be positively surprised. And what you find is that a lot of colleges, it remains this kind of wishy-washy position. We don't require them, but I kind of like to see them. Or most applicants submit them. Yeah. So no, don't worry about whiplash change that really changes your plans. No.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Do you have an opinion on if my son, of course, is in the toss-up spot between the SAT and the ACT? Do you have an opinion on which score is easier to improve, or is that where you've had more success with?
Great question. In the aggregate, no, they're equally coachable, and our stats are the same. For individual students, one may be more efficient to improve, and sometimes we can read those tea leaves. Sometimes he may have a hunch, which we would rely on. But this is the problem. I have parents, Wall Street parents who argue, no, I don't like your advice. We need to do full prep for both tests, because how do we know on which of the two tests the student has more room to improve? They very narrowly have a point, but it's not a laboratory experiment. Show me the kid that has unlimited time for both. I think that's going to take away from something more important. So ultimately, you got to either go with your gut or your read of inconclusive data, but you're at least asking the right question. So yeah, ask the student, on which of these do you think you have more potential to improve?
And your recommendation is pick one.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you change, and all is not wasted leading up to that, but your intent should be to focus primarily or entirely on one. Yes?
If you were just take the ACT, but you struggle up with the science section,
Yeah.
is that an easy section?
For a lot of students, it's really coachable. Did you do comparatively much better on the reading?
I got equal scores on both tests.
So within the ACT, you would look at your reading compared to your science. It's ultimately a lot of similar skills. The science format is just weird. But the short answer is yes, the science is very, very coachable. And I would not walk away from a test you otherwise think might be best for you just because first go at science was shaky. Sometimes students, having seen it once, before you finalize a decision, you do another round of practice testing. It sounds like a drag, but sometimes that's done to try to really, really zero in on it. Okay. Well, seriously, these have been great questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for coming.
Hi, how you doing? I'm
Hi.
Zach Aaronpoint's dad.
Great to meet you.
I have a feeling that Luke didn't get to take both tests. I know you probably might. I think he might have missed one. Do you have any suggestion about how to take the one that he missed? I'm pretty sure it was a soccer issue.
Was it?
He's a big soccer player. I'm not sure which one. But
I
yeah.
and then